election that broke the country. November 6th, 1860. A man walks out of a telegraph office in Springfield, Illinois, and says nothing. He doesn't need to. The numbers on the wire have already spoken. In a matter of hours, Abraham Lincoln will become President of the United States. And in a matter of months, 7 states will vote to leave the country rather than accept it. This is not a story about a war. Not yet. This is the story of the vote that made the war feel inevitable. A 4-way collision of ambition, denial, and fear, where the ballot box itself became a battlefield. And the losers decided the only answer was to walk away. By the time the polls closed that November night, the United States were no longer very united at all. A nation splitting at the seams. To understand how one election could fracture a country, you have to understand that the country was already cracking, quietly, for decades, beneath the surface of every compromise Congress could invent. Slavery was the fault line, not the only issue, but the one no compromise could permanently paper over. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each one was sold as the deal that would finally settle the question, and each one only delayed it, while the argument grew sharper and the middle ground grew thinner. By the late 1850s, that middle ground was nearly gone. Bleeding Kansas had already shown what happened when the argument turned violent. Settlers on both sides of the slavery question burning farms and killing neighbors over how a single territory would vote. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision had thrown gasoline on it, ruling that Black Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had no power to ban slavery in the territories at all. And in 1859, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, an attempt to spark a slave uprising by force, had turned the argument from politics into something that looked to many Southerners like the beginning of war. By 1860, the 2 political parties that had managed to hold the country together for a generation were no longer strong enough to do it. The Whigs were already dead, and the party that replaced them, the Democrats, were about to come apart in front of the entire country, on camera, in real time.
The party that couldn't agree on itself. In April 1860, the Democratic Party gathered in Charleston, South Carolina, a city that, within a year, would fire the first shots of the Civil War. It was, in hindsight, the worst possible place to hold a party that was about to tear itself apart over slavery. The frontrunner was Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, sharp, ambitious, and famous for one deceptively simple idea: popular sovereignty. Let the settlers of each territory vote on whether to allow slavery themselves, rather than have Washington decide for them. It sounded like democracy. To Southern Democrats, it sounded like betrayal, because letting the people decide meant slavery might lose. Southern delegates wanted more than that. They wanted a national guarantee, the right to bring slavery into any territory, protected by federal law, no vote required. Douglas wouldn't give it to them. And so, in the sweltering heat of a Charleston convention hall, 50 delegates from 8 southern states stood up and walked out. The party tried again in Baltimore. It splintered further. By the time the dust settled, the Democrats hadn't picked one candidate. They picked 2. Northern Democrats nominated Stephen Douglas. Southern Democrats nominated John C. Breckinridge, the sitting vice president, on a platform that flatly demanded federal protection of slavery in the territories. The party that had governed the country for most of the last 3 decades had just split down the same line that was about to split the nation itself.
The other 2 candidates. If the Democrats splitting into 2 wasn't enough chaos, a third party arrived, hoping to make the mess even bigger. More, depending on how you saw it, to save the country from it entirely. The Constitutional Union Party wasn't really a party with a platform. It was a group of aging, mostly Southern moderates, many of them former Whigs, who looked at the growing crisis and offered a single, almost desperate promise: ignore the whole argument. No stance on slavery in the territories, no expansion, no restriction, just the Constitution, the Union, and the enforcement of the laws. Their candidate, John Bell of Tennessee, wasn't trying to win the argument. He was trying to make everyone stop having it. And then there was the party that had grown from almost nothing into a serious national force in just 6 years.
A map, not a majority. Here is the fact that made the election of 1860 so unlike almost any other in American history. Abraham Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in 10 southern states. He didn't need it to. With 4 candidates splitting the vote, Lincoln didn't need a national majority. He needed the North. And the North, by 1860, held enough electoral votes on its own to win the presidency outright if it voted as a bloc. Lincoln's strategy, really the Republican Party's strategy, understood this cold arithmetic perfectly. Win the free states, ignore the South almost entirely, let the other 3 candidates fight over the rest of the map. It worked exactly as designed. On election night, Lincoln carried almost every northern state. Douglas, despite running second in the popular vote nationwide, won only Missouri outright. Breckinridge swept most of the Deep South. Bell took the border states that wanted no part of the fight. The final numbers told the real story with brutal clarity. Lincoln won a comfortable majority of the Electoral College, but less than 40% of the national popular vote. A clear majority of voting Americans had cast a ballot against him. For the first time in the nation's history, a president had been elected almost entirely on the strength of one reason.
We are not safe. To Southern political leaders, the message was not subtle. It didn't matter that Lincoln had publicly promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed. It didn't matter that he wouldn't take office for another 4 months. What mattered was the arithmetic. A purely Northern party, hostile to the expansion of slavery, had just won the presidency without needing a single Southern vote, and could, in theory, do it again and again, forever. For a political system built on the assumption that the South's voice was essential to any national outcome, that was the frightening part. Not what Lincoln had said he would do. What his election proved could be done without them. South Carolina moved first, the same state where the Democratic Party had shattered 7 months earlier. On December 20th, 1860, a state convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Within 6 weeks, 6 more Deep South states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. Lincoln had not yet taken the oath of office. He had not signed a single law. And already, a quarter of the country had decided it was no longer part of the country at all.
The country Lincoln inherited. When Abraham Lincoln finally stood on the Capitol steps in March 1861 to take the oath of office, he did so as president of a nation that had already begun coming apart in his absence. 7 states had formed a new government of their own, the Confederate States of America, before he had spoken a single word as president. He appealed in his inaugural address to what he called the better angels of our nature. He insisted he had no intention and no legal power to touch slavery where it existed. He pleaded for time, for patience, for reunion without bloodshed. It wasn't enough. 6 weeks later, Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the war that the election had made feel inevitable finally arrived in fact. It's tempting, looking back, to imagine the Civil War as the product of one election, as if a different result in November 1860 might have changed everything. But the truth is harder and more revealing than that. The election didn't create the fracture. It exposed one that had been widening for 40 years, hidden beneath compromise after compromise, until the machinery of democracy itself could no longer produce a result both halves of the country would accept. That's the part of this story that still echoes. A democracy depends on losers accepting the outcome. In 1860, for the first time,
a significant part of the country decided it would not because the process had failed, but because the result revealed a truth they weren't willing to live with. The election of 1860 didn't start the Civil War. It just made everyone finally admit the war was already coming. If you want to understand how a single vote can reveal, not create, the fractures already running beneath a nation, this is a story worth sitting for. Subscribe for more turning points where history held its breath before everything changed.